بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the essentials of worship, we looked in the last part at what are the invalidating actions, but we looked before that at the principles related to the actions that invalidate the prayer and are disliked in the prayer. And what are some of these principles that are of the actions that you're not supposed to do in the prayer? What are some of the principles?
Not trying to fiddle with your clothes.
Yeah. So fiddling, and we'll see that's from the disliked actions, but there's principles before that. Yeah. So you're not supposed to look around. Those are details, but underlying it is what is the heart of the prayer.
Having focus and being mindful.
Yeah, having focus, being mindful, having presence of heart in the prayer. So anything that goes against having presence of heart in the prayer and focus is not supposed to be done. And this meaning of reverence, right, of deep awe and respect. So we saw that there are levels of actions that you're not supposed to do, right? That what is the principle of the things that break the prayer? Yeah, so excessive action, right? Excessive action breaks the prayer, right? And we saw that it's the onlooker principle. Someone saw you, they wouldn't think you're praying. So like on the spot, they saw you doing that, they wouldn't think you're praying. And that's also sinful. Like deliberately breaking prayer is without excuse is sinful, right? Normally, and if there's an excuse, then that's a separate matter, right? Then fidgeting or repeated unnecessary actions without need would be prohibitively disliked, right? And that's also sinful, right? That you're at the basketball game and you're praying, but the qibla intersects the court, so you're watching the game while you're praying, right? Makruh. Right? Then you have slight unnecessary movements without need are somewhat disliked. And we're going to be looking at the differentiator between the disliked actions today. Right? The differentiator between disliked actions today. There's a general principle that underlies this as well, which is that one is careful not to do things that are prohibitively one is careful not to leave the wajib actions of the prayer, right? And we looked at what the wajib actions were. If you leave the wajib actions, it is prohibitively disliked, right? Like what are some of the wajib actions of the prayer? Nope. Sunnah. I'm sure you know some. No, just one of the wajib actions. Yeah, so saying the first tashahhud, for example, it's wajib. Someone left it, does it break the prayer? No. Right? Does it break the prayer? No. But if someone did it deliberately, they left the wajib, but it's also prohibitively disliked. It's sinful. And you say like, it won't break my prayer, I won't do it. That's sinful because we are commanded to do those wajib actions, but not quite at the same level as the fard. So the prayer is still valid, but it becomes deficient. We saw what happens if you leave a wajib previously, right? And we'll be coming to it again when we look at the sujood as-sahu, the prostration of forgetfulness. Now so if you leave a wajib, right, it's prohibitively disliked, right? It should not be done, and it's sinful, right? Then leaving a sunnah, the emphasized sunnah, the sunnah mu'akkada, and these are the central sunnahs of the prayer. Right? Leaving an emphasized sunnah is disliked. It is disliked. So if you leave any of the emphasized sunnahs without excuse, it's disliked. And making it a habit to miss it can become sinful, especially if there's no excuse. And especially if you know. Right? If you know, it's more grave than if you don't know. Right? So we don't, when we look at the disliked acts, there's some general principles, which is they say tarku kulli wajib, leaving every wajib. Right? Leaving every emphasized sunnah. Right? They can be situations where, if there's an emergency going on, something, you leave some of the emphasized sunnahs, then there can be an excuse. However, that's rarely the case. Because how much time do you save by leaving the emphasized sunnahs? What are some of the emphasized sunnahs? Sorry? Yeah. Like the tasbih in ruku and sujood, right? It's emphasized sunnah. Such as making the tasbih of the different positions, sending the salat al-Ibrahimiyya, the durood in the final sitting, sending salat on the Prophet ﷺ. So these should not be omitted without excuse. So leaving any wajib or leaving any sunnah is disliked. Then if we look at what the author here, Shaykh Abu Bakr al-Mulla, he says, وَمَكْرُوهَاتُهَا, the disliked actions of the prayer, there's a comprehensive one, which is al-abath, fidgeting, right? Whether with one's clothes or one's body or anything else, right? Fidgeting, which is repeated movements without need and without clear benefit. Someone's fidgeting with there's a difference between touching one's beard, like, the beard's getting itchy, so someone fixes it. Someone, their hijabs droop down, or their caps, getting up, it's sort of at a funny angle. So with one movement, they fix it. That's not fidgeting, right? That's just, slight movement. And sometimes it's better to avoid, but sometimes it can be helpful, right? You got some dust on your forehead, so you wiped it out with one motion. That's one thing. But abath would be that, okay, you realize that the place you're prostrating has some sand on it, so you move your foot forward and you're sweeping with your foot. Is that needed in the prayer? No. So that could well become fidgeting if you do it enough, right? With one's clothing too, right? Fidgeting with one's clothing. You're playing around with a button, for example, etc. Or with your body, right? You got a new haircut, so you're checking it out, or you're fidgeting. Fidgeting with your fingers, right? You got your nails done, and you didn't think guys could get their nails done, but you did it. So you're repeatedly just checking how nice your nails feel. So, but it reaches a level of being fidgeting. Right? If it's a slight movement, somewhat disliked. When it's fidgeting, it's probably disliked. The Prophet ﷺ forbade what he called a takhassur, which is to place both hands on your sides. Right? Unless there's a need. Your trousers are about to fall down, your shalwar, right? So you grabbed it for a need, which is to save your prayer, right? And then you tie it with slight movement, that's a need. But like you come up from ruku' and the imam's standing for a long time, so you put your hands on the side. Why? So we do it, it's makruh because the Prophet ﷺ forbade it, but why would putting your hands on the side in the prayer be makruh? So imagine you get up from ruku' and you're standing like that. Yeah, it's takabbur. They say لأنه من هيئة المتكبرين, because it's from the posture of the arrogant, right? Unless in the right context, right? Someone standing for a long time, overseeing like a soccer game or something. So, or someone training, whatever. So they're concentrating like that. But it's not a posture befitting the prayer, right? So, unless there's some reason for it, right? Unless someone has, like they have a cramp, so just a moment, they just put their hands on the side and stretched or something briefly because they needed to, that's separate, right? So when there's a need, that's excluded. So that's takhassur, because the Prophet ﷺ forbade it, right? Waliltifat, and looking left and right. Slightly, it's somewhat disliked. Significantly, it would be sinful, right? Especially if you turn your whole neck, right? Because there's no case for that. And we took, if you turn with your chest, what happens? If you move your chest away from the qibla, yeah, it breaks the prayer. Wattamatti, and stretching, right? Again, it doesn't break the prayer, but it's unbecoming the prayer because it manifests what? Laziness. And that's against those meanings that we talked about related to the prayer. The Prophet ﷺ also forbade iqa', which is to sit in the tashahhud or between the two prostrations on one's rear with one's legs, with one's knees raised, right? Unless that's the only way that someone could sit in the prostration, right? So what's the harm in it? Number one, there's a sunnah way of sitting between the two sajdas, between the two prostrations, the sunnah way of sitting for the tashahhud. So one, you left the sunnah, but number two, this is not expressive of the respect that is due in the prayer, right? Right? Like, how does one sit in a respectful posture, right? Because we don't sit commonly on the ground, but if someone's sitting respectfully, they would sit either on their knees or cross-legged if they couldn't, right? If they're a little more relaxed, but cross-legged. But sitting back, that's what you do at a picnic, right? Like because if you put your rear on the ground, your legs up, then you're quite relaxed, right? Like that's not, and the prayer is relaxing maybe, but it is ta'zeem. Like if that would be, that's the qibla, you sat like this, and you don't have any excuse, right? That's not particularly respectful, right? Right? If you go visit someone respected in your family, and and they have like a ground seating, that's not how you would meet them. At least when you relax afterwards, you could sit like that, but you don't go, so that's why it's makruh. Of course, someone didn't know, someone has bad knees, whatever, they would have an excuse. If they can comfortably sit like that, for the tashahhud, it'd be better, that they should do that. And then for men to put their forearms on the ground fully in prostration. Right? One, because it goes against the sunnah for men, which is that they keep their forearms off the ground and their arms away from their sides in the prostration. But this is makruh for men, but it is sunnah for women. It's sunnah for women. And we've touched upon that before, that some people get very excited about that. But the mashayikh also mentioned that there's one thing that's theoretically true. How one implements it, it's not the sunnah to get into arguments, right? Because if you're in a masjid, your local masjid is all, don't put your forearms on the ground, sister. In some situations, just raise your hands a little bit and avoid the argument, right? Because there's some people who, if you explain, well, there's different ways you do it, etc., they listen, it won't cause division, etc. But if you can do something in a way that avoiding disunity is a major consideration, right? One of my teachers, and he's a Shafi'i scholar, he told the people at the students at the masjid, that if someone tries to put their foot against you in the prayer, put your foot right next to theirs. And intend to help them concentrate in their prayer, and to help them not distract you in the prayer as well, so that you can concentrate. And that'll be more pleasing to Allah than be doing foot dancing in the prayer. In some places, like, you move your foot, they move their foot. Though Sheikh Hamza once mentioned from Sheikh Abdullah al-Qadi that someone put their foot next to the foot of one of the mashayikh. So the sheikh put his foot on the other side of the man's leg. Right? Like now, that was like checkmate. Now what do you do? Right? So the person's trying to move their foot, put the foot right next to this guy. So he put his foot like past the other guy's leg. So now what's he going to do? So he withdrew his foot and he put it back. But that's not, the prayer is not about who's next to you. It's about being present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And the next one, tashmiru kummayhi, to fold up one's sleeves, right? To fold up one's sleeves, right? And the same thing applies to fold up one's trousers. And you see some people doing that. Now, folding up one's sleeves, there are two reasons why this is makruh. And there's hadiths about it in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere. One is that it's not a respectable appearance, right? It's not a respectable appearance. But the second one is that it would lead one to distraction and fidgeting. Because if you just roll up your sleeves, what's going to happen? You go into ruku', you come out of ruku', your sleeve's going to move around. And then you're going to need to fix it. So one, because it's improper. Number two, because it'll lead to fidgeting. And the same thing with trousers, right? Rolling them up. They say if it's folded neatly, especially something that has like a cuff, if you folded it neatly, right, then it's not disliked. If it doesn't, like it's summertime, you're wearing a long shirt and it's hot, and you rolled it up neatly such that it doesn't look improper, it doesn't lead to fidgeting. Same with trousers. If you folded them up neatly, then in some context it wouldn't be improper, right? وَرَدُّ السَّلَامِ بِالْإِشَارَةِ, answering the salam with a hand gesture. It doesn't break the prayer, but it's somewhat disliked. Right? Unless there's a need. Right? Unless there's a need, someone's a new Muslim, for example. Right? So if you didn't do anything, or you start working at pizzeria and the person didn't realize you're praying, so you just go like this, right? Just give me a second, right? And you intend to greet them, right? You don't intend to greet them, but you intend the interest of the prayer, right? This should break the prayer, but there's hadiths saying that it doesn't. So it doesn't. Tying up one's hair for men, just gathering up one's hair is somewhat disliked. The Prophet ﷺ told some men that, because again, one, it would be unbecoming within the prayer, right, of humility, and the ulama differed on what's the wisdom behind it, right? But for a man who's got loose hair, just to gather them up for the prayer, Prophet ﷺ said to let your hair prostrate with you, right? That applies to men. Now, if someone has braided hair, then this would not apply, unless they gathered the braids too, right? Just last minute, one gathered one's braids. They say one of the things would be could also lead to fidgeting. Right? You just gather hair, just last moment, then there's quite a lot of likelihood of it distracting you. Putting on a turban without wearing something underneath, right, so there's a big hole on top. They said that this also the Prophet ﷺ said to avoid it. The reason being that it looks undignified. And you tie an open turban, unless there's something covering, because there's some ways people tie a turban and the top is covered, right? So it doesn't look, it's not, everything has a proper manner to it. So it's undignified. It's also, and then the next one is for a man to pray with his head uncovered is somewhat disliked, because the general sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is that his head would be covered both in the prayer and outside the prayer. So within the prayer, it's a specific sunnah, and it's from the adab of the deen and a sunnah of the habits of the Prophet ﷺ to have one's head covered outside the prayer when possible, right? And it's a lot of Muslim men neglect that as a sunnah, but it is a sunnah of the worldly sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And they also say, they say there's a general principle that al-ma'sur la yusqitu al-maysur, that when something is difficult in a particular context, it does not lift what is easy in other contexts, right? So in certain situations, it might be difficult for them to do that, but in other situations, it's facilitated. So at least where it is facilitated, the prayer or religious gathering, etc., it is a recommended sunnah that people should not neglect. And it's also from human dignity, right? And it's one of the sunnahs of humanity. Throughout human civilizations, people have practiced it, and in different ways. And the next one is sadlu thawbihi. It's to drape anything on oneself. They say huwa al-wada' duna lubsin mu'tad. It's to put something on without a regular way of wearing it, right? So whether you put something on your head or on one shoulder or two, and you just drape it. Why? Because it'll lead to distraction and fidgeting. Right? So you put on a shawl, right? Now, if it's very cold and there's nothing else you can do, then there's an excuse. That's an excuse. But in normal, it's a little chilly, you want to wear a shawl, just draping it, both ends will be dangling. You come up from ruku', you'll notice one end went this way, one went that. So it'll lead to fidgeting and distraction. So you wrap it in a manner that would not lead to fidgeting or distraction. Right? So generally, if you're wearing a shawl, generally the mashayikh would just put it down. Or if you have a shawl and you put it over one shoulder, one end over one shoulder, in a manner that if you went into ruku' or got up from ruku', it wouldn't fall off, etc., then it's not disliked. And also, the mashayikh say practically, don't experiment with fancy new clothing for the prayer. Right? So you go to the masjid, it's quiet, and they have, some of the masajid in some of the Muslim world, they have these big jubbas that the imam might wear. But you didn't realize the imam was 4 inches taller than you. So you pray in the jubba, there's one of the or the aba'ah, they call it another. You pray in it. Now you're not used to praying in it. So when you get up from sajda, what happens? You trip over, right? Because it's really wide. There's a way you go into sajda with it, which practically is you just keep your hands to your side, so it kind of gathers it up without extra movement, right? But you got your fancy new thobe. Get used to it a little bit, and it's really wide. You heard that it's recommended to wear loose clothing, so one of the Egyptian scholars said that wearing respectable clothing is sunnah. He said even for women. He said some people wear clothing so big that in the old days they could have used it as a tent for the whole family. And Egyptians have this way of joking around, right? He said one of these people, and he was complaining that people import habits from other parts of the world, etc. He said our women have been modest since Islam came here, right? So some of them, like, they ask you a question, you don't know if the question's coming from the right side or the left side, or they're in front of you, right? And he went all Masri on the whole thing. But there's something dignified, right? So someone wear huge clothing, that'll be undignifiedly huge, even in religious circles. And it's not the only clothing that they have. In that kind of situation, sometimes can even help this outside the prayer. Okay, how do I go into ruku' and out without it causing me distraction, right? The next one, salatuhu fi thiyab al-bidla, praying in worn out clothing or in unclean clothing or undignified clothing, right? Meaning, practically, the clothing you would not wear in front of respectable people, right? And it's good, a lot of people, they would have a set of home clothing that they just drape on in order to pray in a dignified manner. And this idea of dignity is an important value, right? There's dignity, and the sense that in any context there is what is considered respectable conduct, respectable manners, respectable dress, right? Right? Even now, this is somewhat disliked. It's not prohibited, it's not, but, and different contexts, what is respectable and dignified would differ, but it's something one should keep in mind. Yawning is also disliked. If one yawns without need, it is. If one yawns without need, it is makruh. Right? If one yawns without need, it is makruh. And if one yawns without need and makes a sound, it's like speaking. So your friend memorized Surah Yasin and in Fajr, and you guys had a late night, starts saying Yasin, and he's reciting, and you're like, oh my goodness. What do I do now? You go, oh, just to indicate that, please, have mercy on me. That would break the prayer, because that was without need and with sound. Right? If yawning overcomes you, then if you're able to contain it, then it's recommended to contain it, right? Either just close your mouth, bite your lip, cover your mouth, whichever way you're able to restrain it, it's recommended. Beginning the prayer, go ahead.
What if you're reciting you have to restart the surah?
No. If you recite in a yawn, just continue. Right? If it overcomes you, it's excused. But the adab is, what's recommended is that one cover one's mouth then. Right? Beginning, needing to relieve oneself is prohibitively disliked. The Prophet ﷺ forbade it. Right? And a lot has come from the early Muslims as well, of how it's, if you need to use the washroom, you should go use the washroom. That's one of the adab of the deen in general. It's against the sunnah to delay using the washroom. So much so that if you need to relieve yourself and you're praying, you break the prayer, go relieve yourself, and then continue. Even if you're in Salat al-Jama'ah, you have the reward of the Jama'ah. And then of course everyone knows their intention, right? You go to the masjid and Sidi Ahmed's leading and he experimenting with long surahs, and now I got to use the washroom. So you go there and you spend extra long just so you can finish. In those situations, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Each person shall have whatever they intended. You intended to miss the Jama'ah, you get the reward of that. Someone went to the masjid and they made wudu at home and everything. They get to the masjid and they lost their wudu. What happened? Are they rewarded for the Jama'ah? Yeah, as long as they did their best to catch it. So they went, used the washroom quickly. They made a quick wudu. They caught what they caught. They make up what they missed, but they have the full reward. Right? Similarly, if you were about to start praying in congregation, you need to use the washroom, you have the full reward. But you're still responsible for trying to catch it quickly, but you don't rush things. But in that situation, you would leave all the sunnahs, if necessary, to be able to catch the jama'ah. Right? This is unless it becomes misgivings. Every time you go to pray, I think I may need to use the washroom. This is when you're holding in the urge of going to the washroom. Like you're actively holding in the urge, it's makruh tahrim to begin the prayer or to be praying in that situation. Some of the scholars, including Shaykh Abu Bakr al-Mulla, he said that beginning the prayer, needing to relieve yourself, is prohibitively disliked. But if the urge overcomes you within the prayer, it's somewhat disliked to continue praying that way, but not prohibitively disliked. Because a lot of people get a lot of waswasa and so on. But it is against the sunnah. So practically, if it's just a minor urge that the thought occurs to you, but it's not actively on your mind, ignore it. But if you're holding in the urge before the prayer, it's prohibitively disliked to pray in that way. Now there could be excuses. You're at Seekers, it's Maghrib time, but they say, sorry, according to regulations, the washroom's closed. And it's just a minor urge, just pray with them. Right? So that's an excuse. Praying with one's eyes closed is somewhat disliked. Why? Because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was he would look towards his place of prayer. Unless it is to preserve khushu', preserve presence of heart, then it's not disliked, but it is still recommended to get used to praying with your eyes open, because it's closer to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Because then your eyes themselves are engaging in ibadah, right? And it's a metaphor for life, right? As believers, our eyes are open in this life, right? But we lower our gaze from the things that busy us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we keep our hearts focused on Allah in the rough and tumble of life. And that's what we do in the prayer. Our eyes are open, the distractions of this world are around us, but we lower our gaze and we turn our hearts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's great spiritual wisdom in it, right? And there's never anything that is spiritually better than the specific prophetic guidance. Raising one's gaze towards the sky in the prayer is disliked. Now, if you're standing on a mountaintop and you're just praying naturally and you raise from ruku, you see it, it's not makruh, because it's raising your gaze towards the sky, right? It's makruh, right? Because prayer is about humbling yourself. Now, it's not wrong to raise your gaze towards the sky sometimes. Actually, the Prophet ﷺ would look towards the sky when he got up at night after making wudu, but before praying, the Prophet ﷺ would recite the closing verses of Surah Ali Imran, verse 190 to 200, frequently. The hadiths are in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere. And in some of the narrations it mentions, the sound, that he would raise his gaze towards the sky while reciting those in reflection. The Sahaba mentioned that in general, in the sitting of the Prophet ﷺ, كان نظره إلى الأرض أكثر من نظره إلى السماء. The Prophet ﷺ's gazing towards the ground would be more frequent than his gazing towards the sky. What's understood from it? That the Prophet ﷺ also gazed towards the heavens, right? In reflection. And sometimes that can be very useful. Someone feels stressed, overwhelmed, etc. It's good to look towards the sky in reflection and to engage in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? To say subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah wallahu akbar, and look towards the heaven. So wiping away dust from one's forehead, or dusting your clothes, for example, within the prayer is somewhat disliked if with slight movement. It becomes fidgeting. You got up and now you're like, okay, I got it on my elbow and my knee, and you stretch down, wipe your trouser pants, right? It can reach a level of fidgeting too. It's better just to leave it, like if it's on your forehead. If it distracts you somewhat, then one does it with a minimum movement, and that's a need. It's distracting you. You feel like there's a pebble on the edge of your nose. It's probably not a pebble, but so you try to ignore it, but it's distracting you. Just one movement, and but after the prayer, it's religiously recommended. It's sunnah that if if you've got dust on your forehead, or say, oh, this is from my ibadah. Yeah, it's good, but also being dignified is also ibadah, right? So, just like when you make wudu, drying yourself, if it's going to wet your clothing, etc., is recommended. It's not good. Some people come out from wudu, it looks like they engage in jihad or something, right? And that's not dignified. Praying in the presence of pictures is disliked, right? Before images of living things, right? It's prohibitively disliked if it's in front of you, above you, or to your sides. It's less disliked if it's behind you, right? If it's far away, or there's a barrier between you and it, there is leeway. This applies for sure to paintings of humans or animals or statues. Right? Pictures, there's khilaf. Some of the ulama would say that the pictures of human beings have the same ruling as, in terms of hanging them up, as paintings, but some places that can be difficult. It's not your own home, and in some places people put up pictures. The ulama differ on that. Some see it as being exactly the same as putting up a painting of a human or an animal. Others said no, pictures are different, like photographs are different. There's a reason to be cautious, but if you're visiting family or in the living room, they have some pictures up, then it certainly shouldn't be right in front of where the imam is praying, or right in their presence, or left or right of it, in the same majlis. So you're considered to be in the same place as the pictures. Where you have a choice, find a place where they're not there. But something like if you're visiting a friend's house or something, you can't exactly go and take down the picture, etc. So there's a leeway. Pictures are easier than paintings, because the surah that's come in the hadith refers to either like what we'd call like a statue or a painting. Right? Photos, the cautious thing, putting them up, one should. A lot of the ulama would say one avoids it, but at the same time there are righteous, pious ulama who put pictures of their mashayikh up and so on, right? What are you going to do? If you go to someone sheikh's house, you say you tell his family, could we take those pictures down? No, because there's khilaf in those matters. But practically, if you're outside, it sometimes happens at airports. Like when I used to travel a lot, you're at an airport and there's different advertising in different places. So it's much further down, but if you have if it's not in your presence, then it's much easier. There's much easier, right? It's not in your immediate vicinity. Okay. Counting the verses or tasbih on your fingers is makruh, because it's something foreign to the actions of the prayer, right? That's if you fold them, for example, right? Or, right? But if you just press them, like if you fold them, like, or you use one finger on top of the other, you decide, okay, I'm going to do 99 tasbihs in ruku' and 101 in sujood. Right? So Sufyan once say, I'm going to do, you read some hadith about the long ruku' and sujood of the Prophet ﷺ, said, I'm going to do that. But then don't count it on your fingers. In general, it's probably better not to count it, because the act of counting there is an inward distraction, but it's not wrong. If you just press down, there's nothing wrong with it. Right? If you just press down, there's nothing wrong with it. So that's counting the tasbihs. Putting something in your mouth while you're praying is somewhat disliked. Right? What would you put in your mouth? All kinds of people put chewing gum, like eaten up chewing gum. Some people just like keeping the chewing gum for hours. You put it. If the chewing gum has anything that you would end up swallowing, it could break the prayer. But you just have chewed up chewing gum, like old stale chewing gum. You still want to keep chewing it, so you stick it in your, somewhere in your mouth. This is somewhat disliked, and if it affects your recitation or causes you distraction, it's more disliked. Some people, of course, put, like there's some tailors that they put like a fine razor. I kid you not, they stick it in there, between their cheek and their, so that if they have to cut, they just take it out and make cuts. Whatever you put in your mouth, right? The leaning against a a wall or leaning against, a staff or anything without need is somewhat disliked. Are you just feeling lazy or like you pray leaning against the wall? No, just stand up. If you're just out of laziness or you're just a bit tired and that's lazy, just stand straight. Now, if it's due to weakness or inability, that's need. Right? Someone is physically weak. If they leaned against something they could comfortably pray, then that's not wrong. Praying facing another person directly is makruh tahriman. Unless they're far away. Such that if you prayed Salat al-Khashi'een, you look down, like you do, they're not in your line of vision. Right? But it's also disliked to sit facing someone who's praying. Okay? Likewise, praying facing an open fire is makruh, because there are people who worship fires. Right? But if it's just, some say, can I pray facing a heater? Nobody's worshipped a heater, I think, even in northern Canada, right? It's like, although you'd be surprised, right? So if it's an open fire, right? Praying in a public pathway is makruh. Or anywhere else where you would be blocking other people. Right? But for example, in airport terminals, for example, you have a broad corridor, and you pray on the side where you're not blocking anybody. That's not makruh, right? One consideration, the more important consideration is it's haqqul ghayr. It's the right of another. Or it's a public right. So if you, in a public place, if you pray, you choose a quiet, a quiet place on the side. Right? And it's not about hiding no, the believer could pray anywhere. Right? But there's no need to do it as an exhibition. Right? أو في الحمام. What is the hammam? What? No. The hammam is the public bath. Right? Praying in the public bath, because there may well be people uncovered there, and it's not dignified. It'd also be somewhat disliked to pray in the washroom, because it's not a dignified place for prayer, but it's valid. It's valid. And once one of the American da'is, he came to RIS, and there's a Coptic, there's a sister of Egyptian Christian background, Coptic, but she'd converted. Her family were very concerned about their children becoming Muslim, so everybody had to keep their doors open. They couldn't close their door for studying. Said, I can barely close the door if I'm changing clothes. It's like, it was very, and they're a conservative family. So I said, I don't have any opportunity to pray. What do I do? And she was really keen. So I said, it's simple. You do have a washroom, right? I said, yeah. I said, pray there. I said, how? So you learn how to pray? I said, yes. You could pray on the ground in the washroom. It's considered tahir, but you put a towel on the ground, pray on it, fold the towel, put it back. Now, normally it's somewhat disliked to choose a washroom to pray in. And it's not dignified of the believer, right? Let's say you work in that building, right? Now you could technically come outside and pray over here. Would anyone prevent you? No. Would anyone object? No. You're like, I don't want them to know I'm Muslim, this and that. I'm going to pray in the disabled washroom. Number one, the prayer is valid, but that's somewhat disliked and is undignified of the believer, right? Because if you don't have there's this idea of al-haya min al-nas. There is being shy before people. And the believer is not shy. Their shyness before Allah exceeds their shyness before people, right? So that if there's a question to ask, and one feels shy to ask in front of others, one still asks. Why? Because one needs to know the answer. And even if it's on a sensitive topic. Now, where one can do it indirectly, that's better. But sometimes it doesn't occur. This is the opportunity. Right? One doesn't deliberately ask an awkward question, but there's a couple, Umar and I have known them for since university. So I went to the States, and their son was on the lady side. He was like 6 or 7. And at the Q&A session, first question from the back, and I know the kid. Says, Shaykh Faraz, I have a question. So yes. Said, at what age should boys get circumcised? And I saw a tugging because his mother tugged hard at his hand, right? And there's nothing wrong with the question. So I thanked him for asking a frank question. And he wanted to go into details. I cut off the details because I knew the backstory, right? Which is the parents differed. I think one of the parents wanted to do it once he hit puberty. فالمهم, praying in the hammam, the public bath, is somewhat disliked, right? Depending on where you do it. Now, if there's a place in the public bath designated for prayer, right? Like this is the hammam Arabi, the Arab bath, then that's a separate thing. This is where everybody is. The mashayikh generally would say public baths are of 2 types, right? There are those that are dignified public baths, right? Where the vast majority of people would be observing Shari'i guidelines and so on. Then that's there's nothing wrong with visiting that, right? And then there are others that are not. There certainly the religious should not go there. And then there are questionable public baths which no person of uprightness should go anywhere close to that, right? Because all kinds of wacky things happen in some public baths. I never got to go. Umar said, you will not go to a public bath in Damascus. Try to explain that there's one that was founded by Nuruddin Zenji. Says, a lot of other things are founded by Nuruddin Zenji. Go there. It's like, so actually I took one of my good friends to the door of the bath, and I said, I'll see you in an hour. But we didn't have cell phones, whatever. So I stood outside the bath for half an hour, waiting for him to come out. But things you do. Praying in a graveyard is makruh, except away from the graves. Except away from the graves. Praying in another's property without their permission is makruh. Now, in work situations, we have to also be aware that there's a legal right in much of the world for reasonable accommodation, right? So where you have a right to reasonable accommodation, reasonable religious accommodation, you have a right to take that right. Right? This would not be from that, right? And it's also sometimes common sense. Like you're visiting non-Muslim family members. If you go down to the basement, because there's a washroom in the basement, they'll let you go downstairs to the basement, right? And just pray 2 rakats and just have husn al-dhan that they'll give you permission. Because why would they prevent you, right? And sometimes you have to let common sense prevail. If you're in someone's house without permission, so with permission, then you could assume that you have permission to pray there too, right? Right? And the reason for that, like I have a friend who, he had a lot of family members, and miskeen, like their family had a lot of issues with drug use and this and that. That's partly what led him to become Muslim. But a whole wave of them became born again Christians. See, for a while he stayed with his mother. His mother would pray in front of them with his little kids. That, she'd pray to Jesus. save my son from the devil. Like before and after food. So in a situation like that, like you don't have to ask permission. You have permission to be there. You know, just take the general permission and that's it. But, you know, you go to someone else's office. You go in just to pray without asking them permission. That's not befitting, right? But like you go to a strip mall, and cars are parked there. There's lots of space. It's technically someone's property, but for example, is this parking lot owned by somebody? Yeah. Let's say you came to Seekers and it's closed. Is this land belonging to somebody? Yeah. But if you just came and prayed, now don't make i'tikaf here. Like you can make i'tikaf, but don't do qiyam al-layl here. You can see somebody objecting. So it needs common sense as well, right? So the mashayikh say in things like that which, like if someone parked their car over there, would they be allowed to walk across here? Yeah. Like it's in a public area, right? So that would be reasonably considered fair use. You can pray there as long as you're not interrupting or inconveniencing anybody. That's what the mashayikh mentioned. If you take this very literally, you will make your life very difficult. And even in the most conservative areas, like we've been through through rural Kansas and Kentucky, when we've gone for some of the Seekers trips. Like we used to have Seekers retreats in Tennessee. So we stopped in like total redneck areas, and prayer time comes, you pray. One of the things is when you pray in these kinds of places, pray in a dignified way. Right? And it's deeply respectable. It's deeply respectable. Right? In one of these places, Omar went to pay for the gas. I went to look for snacks, and she felt a bit uncomfortable. Even the ladies were like big and like, they're sort of hefty. And I'm like, I was just in a corner just because everybody's badly dressed, right? Like the men, the women. So I'm just like, I'd already chosen what I was going to get, but then Omar said, come with me in the line. And I said, okay. And the lady at the cash was looking really intense, like she wanted to like beat someone up. I was like, uh-oh, now Omar is coming there, she's wearing her jilbab. And she's being mean to everybody in the line. I'm like, uh-oh, this is going to be interesting, ya Rab, ya Rab, ya Rab. Came to Omar and she was so kind. She said, can you believe how people dress these days? God bless you. And she was so nice. And Omar is really good with these kinds of social encounters. Right? But if you're being dignified, you have good khuluq, and you act in a way, one should not, and there people are going to be unreasonable. People are going to be unreasonable in the Muslim world, right? Like if you go, you find even like sometimes you visit like family members, etc., and they'll argue with you about religious matters. So that's just life. Praying in the presence of food that one is inclined towards is also makruh. If one is thinking about the food, right? So you just made this smoothie that you've been wanting to have all day, and Maghrib came in. Drink the smoothie, then pray Maghrib, right? But if drinking a little of it would break that inclination, drink a little bit and pray. Okay? Praying with najasa, that's less than that's an excused amount, but when you can remove it. You're at home, you got a little blood on your shirt. It's not the amount that would prevent praying in it, but you can change it. Then it's somewhat disliked to pray with clothes that have najasa on them. However, if you're in a situation where you can't remove the slight filth, right? Then there's no karaha in it. You're at work, etc. There are wisdoms for keeping, if you go to work somewhere, there is wisdoms in keeping a spare set of clothes. Right? And the mashayikh actually mentioned that as well. And I have someone I know, we discussed he said, you jinxed me. I said, how did I jinx you? Guys, we're talking about dress and stuff, and I was saying, like the ulama would say that in general it's better to dress slightly better than what other people are dressed in if you're in a position where you're dealing with the public. It's a sunnah, right? Right? To wear slightly better, but not much better. Like you don't wear a three-piece suit and this and that when you're working as, in sales, because you just look strange, right? But it's part of the karama of the human being, right? And it's also one's an ambassador of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So there's many wisdom, and one does it for the sake of Allah. So he had several times, like he had to be rescued because he crouched to pick up a file or something, and his trousers ripped. So I had a couple of times, it's an emergency, and I couldn't do anything. I'm sitting here in Misaga, my trousers just ripped at work. So what are you doing? So I'm firmly sitting in my seat, but I have meetings coming up. So we said, what do we do? So he called one of his friends and his friend had a spare trouser. I don't know why. He had a locker room. And then when he was engaged, his fiancée bought him a trouser, brought it to work. Alhamdulillah. Then there's just a couple more things that are disliked. One of them is reciting in other than the standing position with the intention of reciting, because that's not the place for recitation in the prayer, right? Prayer is, however, making the du'as from the Quran is not disliked in ruku' nor in sujood. Like you say, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً, etc. Or in prostration you want to say La ilaha illa ant subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin, because when you say that you intend dhikr, you intend dua. There's nothing wrong with that. Making the recitation of the second rak'ah significantly longer than the first rak'ah is somewhat disliked if deliberate. You're clearly aware of it, particularly in the fard. Unnecessarily repeating the same surah in both rak'ahs is somewhat disliked. But if it just happens, first rak'ah you recited Alam Nashrah, second rak'ah you began reciting Alam Nashrah, just continue it. Because once you begin something, the sunnah is you complete it. Reciting in the wrong order, conscious that it's in the wrong order, such that one recites the previous surah or just skips one short surah, is prohibitively disliked. If you're conscious that you're reciting in the wrong order and you just either recite it in reverse order, so you recite Surah Al-Nas then Surah Al-Falaq in the second rak'ah, or recite Surah Al-Nas in the first rak'ah, second rak'ah you recited what's before Surah Al-Falaq? Surah Al-Ikhlas, right? You skipped one. But if in the first rak'ah you recite Surah Al-Falaq, second rak'ah you recited the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, that's not reversing the order. You just didn't observe the order. So that's not makruh. Deliberately smelling perfume is makruh. Now you want to perfume your place of prayer, etc., make it appealing, there's nothing wrong. Are you allowed to breathe in prayer? Yeah. So, it makes you feel the right mood for prayer, nothing wrong. But you put on perfume on both things. And there's a whole art of aromatherapy. My grandfather used to put different perfume on one. They used to put a cotton ball with perfume, and you put one perfume on this side, one perfume on this side. And I had to do something with hikmah, like medical wisdom, like whatever. He told me about it. I was like, please keep that away from me. So give my grandfather a really hard time. Rahmatullahi alayhi. I was also very disturbed. I said, if you know all this stuff about medicine, why don't you do something about your bald head? Because he didn't have any hair on his head. So I was like a couple years old when I went to Umrah, the only Umrah I did. Probably because of my bad adab, I've not been since. The only dua I made in tawaf was that Allah make hair grow on my grandfather's head. That's the only dua I made. I was like 4 maybe. But Deliberately smelling perfume would be somewhat disliked because unnecessary action, right? Not making your toes face the Qibla is somewhat disliked. Not making your toes face the Qibla in prostration is somewhat disliked. Any slight action is somewhat disliked, right? If it's any slight action without excuse. Praying with your mouth and nose covered is somewhat disliked unless it's with excuse, like during present circumstances, for example, right? Because it can affect one's prayer, and it's not the sunnah. But if a woman, for example, wants to cover her face in public, and she is praying in public, then she can, then that's a reason to pray with one's face covered. Then that's prostrating with a barrier between you and between the ground and your forehead is somewhat disliked. So someone's got their cap covering their entire forehead. The sunnah is to pray directly on one's forehead, or at least on something of one's forehead directly. But if what you prostrate on is touching your forehead, it's valid. Right? It's valid. Like, different people have different kinds of hairlines and stuff. So some sisters, they wear like an under hijab or something. It covers a little bit of the forehead. That's fine because at least some of the forehead touches. Even if the whole forehead is covered in the Hanafi madhab, if you prostrated with your forehead covered, it's valid. But it would have been better to at least uncover a little of the forehead. Unless there's an excuse, it's extremely cold, right? For example, you're praying outside. Prostrating with on your forehead without anything of your nose touching the ground is also somewhat disliked. Or prohibitively disliked. It's wajib. Yeah, so it's prohibitively disliked for your nose not to touch the ground even for a moment. Anything of the nose. You don't have to press hard or anything like that. You have to be careful how you learn. Someone said, I heard that you have to press your nose until you can feel the bone, but it starts hurting. So I was told I have to press hard. But this guy must have had a really good teacher, subhanAllah. Same guy heard that when you sniff water in your nose, you have to feel the sting. He says, I get dizzy. I'm like, no, who told you this stuff, right? But that's why language is so important as well, right? Because sometimes the way you put it, that you say sniff hard, sift the water hard up your nose. So up your nose. So people, they don't know. Like that's why studying with the teacher just makes things easier, right? And also, once you just get in the habit of asking, there's no question that's too sniff hard. Doesn't mean that so touching, placing the nose on the ground as well is wajib, as we took, unless there's an excuse. Someone's got a burnt end of the nose or something, those are the makruh acts of prayer. Next week, inshallah, we're going to look at al-witr wal nawafil, witr and the nafil prayers. One of the most senior Saad al-Ba'alawi in Singapore, you Sayyid Abdul Qadir al-Haddad, right? So I keep running into him in funny parts of the world. I've run into him in London. I've met him in Singapore, of course. I've run into him in the Bay Area. I've run into him in Australia, right? So one of the brothers from Canada, this was in Melbourne. We met him. So I told him, ask him for advice. We had dinner with him. We're dropping out. Ask him for advice. So he said, "Alika bin nawafil." Said, be concerned about the nafil. Said because every believer does the fard, insha'Allah. Says, but if you care about Allah, alayka bi bab al-nafil. And he said that, and he said, alayka bi bab al-nafil, and then he walked into the hotel, right? And then he nodded, Salaamu Alaikum wa rahmatullah, as he was going through the thing. So the witr, of course, is wajib, but the nafil prayers, these are an opportunity of, one of the great Indian scholars said that the fard is the right of the lordship of and the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The nafil is the right of Allah, of Allah's beauty. And it's, the fard is ubudiyya, the nafil is mahabba. Right? We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us both ubudiyya of slavehood and of love, and to open for us the door of nawafil. وَلَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ. My servant continues to draw close to me through nafil actions until I love them. Right? And of course, it's not just in the form of the nafil, but also in doing it with outward and inward excellence. Any questions before we close today? Go ahead. Yeah, so if a parent calls one within the prayer, if it doesn't appear to be urgent, then one completes the prayer. But it may be good. And it also depends on circumstance, right? Like, your mother is not sick, or has a medical condition or something. You just, like just something regular. Also, sometimes you can tell with the voice, right? It doesn't appear to be urgent. You finish, but you may want to shorten it, right? And you had the intention, okay, I'm going to do 8 rak'ahs of Salatul Duha. So you give salams after 2, and you have the reward. And if you can go back to it, you go back to it. But if it appears to be urgent, right, either because of context, they're sick or have some condition, or because of the voice, then that's an excuse to break the prayer. Okay, so any questions on that? Alhamdulillah. Since we're almost completed the section on prayer, or the key components of it, we've looked at the conditions, the integrals, the wajib actions of the prayer, the sunnahs, the description of the prayer, what invalidates the prayer, what's makruh. It's a good opportunity to review all of that, right? One, just for one's own practice, because sometimes one omits little details, and every aspect of the sunnah has an inward benefit as well, right? So it helps just to, and even a quick review helps. To make like a checklist. Sometimes, just one test one. So, okay, so what are the sunnahs of the prayer? Okay. But the reason to know them is, okay, I want to implement these in my own prayer. Right? Sometimes it's good to sort of see, okay, these are the sunnah things. There's certain things that you probably don't do. Have you ever stretched out like this in your prayer? Right? The Mashaykh says sometimes there's things that you may struggle with, so it's good to make a checklist of things that you need to be careful about making sure you do, and things that you need to be careful to avoid. So you make your personal checklist, right? Because some of the things I'd never do. Have you ever prayed putting your hands on the side? Like, no. It's okay. So that ilm-wise, that it is, but you say, okay, keeping my gaze on the ground. Say this is one of the first bid'ahs that entered the prayer. Well, the early Muslims said that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people used to look within the place of their sujood. That during the time of the Sahaba, they used to look at the place of their sujood. Then, then when the fitna started, they started looking beyond the point of sujood in the prayer. Right? But they say one of the reasons people don't look at the place of sujood because they've got other things on their mind. So it's a signifier that you're focused on what's within the prayer, that you're looking down. So it just helps that, okay, these are things I need to work on with respect to the sunnahs, the adab, etc. The key things. And that's one way. You hold yourself, okay, am I doing these particular things or not? And in the review, if you have questions, we're at your service, inshallah. Go ahead.
The hadith mentioned at the end, does that mean Allah's love has to be earned through action?
Does Allah's love have to be earned through actions? ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ. That's the bounty of Allah. He gives it to whomever He wills. But the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that there must be effort from the servant. Right? And that's just the adab of love anywhere. Said, you don't express your love in any way, but say, but I love you. That's like there's an adab of love. So we realize that we're undeserving of the love of Allah, and nothing you do makes you worthy of Allah's love. But we have intense seeking of Allah's love, and we also have intense hope, because Allah has given us the means of attaining His love. Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Shaghuri has this beautiful poem in his diwan. He says, قُلْتُ الْهَبْلِ الْآنَ قُرْبًا. Says, when I lost all patience, I said, give me closeness now. قَالَ لَا. The beloved said, no. قُلْتُ وَصْلًا. قَالَ أَتَبْغِي الْأَبْعَدَ. They said, then if you won't give me closeness, give me union with you. Says, you seek what's even more distant. قُلْتُ أَدْخِلْنِي حِمَاكُمْ. قَالَ لَا. Says, then at least make me enter in your sanctuary. And the beloved said, no. قُلْتُ فِي ظِلِّ حِمَاكُمْ مَقْعَدًا. So then in the shade of your sanctuary will I sit down. قال من يهوى يجافي المرقدة. Said, whoever yearns, their sides leave their beds. Meaning whoever yearns, it's not about making claims. I love, I don't. Yeah, you seek love, but فإذا ما شئت أد الثمن. If you seek truly, then pay the price. Right? So then he talks to his own self. He says, قلت نفس يا نفس اقنعي لا تقنطي. So I said to myself, be content, do not despair. وعده حق حباك المصعدة. His promise is true, and He's given you the means of ascent. And what's the mas'ad? The means of ascent? تتجافى جنوبهم عن المضاجع. Their sides leave their beds leave their sides. The sunnah, what is the sunnah? It's a way that is followed in the deen. The tariqatul masluka. To what? To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So you ask Allah for love. He's given you His beloved and told you to follow His beloved. And all of it is very clear. Right? Someone says, could you knock on someone's door. She said, come in. And you just stay standing at the door. Said, I'd love to meet you. Can I come in? And they said, marhaban. All you have to do is open the door. But you have to walk. Right? And of course, the opposite is possible. The opposite is possible. There's people who enter Islam without ever seeking it. Right? There's people who have all kinds of things. One of the great scholars of North Africa, his open. And the other thing is, when does the opening from Allah come? It comes in the most unexpected of ways. That's what the ulama mention. Right? Ibn Ata'ya says, قَلَّ أَن تَأْتِيَ الْوَارِدَاتِ إِلَّا بَغْتَةً. Rarely do divine graces come except unexpectedly. لِأَلَّا يَدَّعِيَهَا أَهْلُهَا. Lest the people who attain them claim them. Sometimes you muck up totally and you find real presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you're broken hearted, that I'm totally messed up. And other times you do something really well and then you find you find your heart empty. Why? Because you're not لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ شَيْءٍ. You have no part of the whole thing. Right? One of the there's a beautiful biography of the awliya of North Africa. It's called Al-Mutrib fi Bayan Awliya al-Maghrib. And one of the great poets of the North African tradition, Sidi Muhammad al-Harraq, he was a great khatib. He's a great faqih and a khatib. And he became Muslim due to a prostitute. As I said, became not Muslim, he had his great spiritual opening. Why? Because some of the other ulama became jealous of him. So they tried criticizing him, it didn't stick, he could out-argue them, everything. So then they decided, and there's dunya is always present, right? And human weak. So what they did, they hired a prostitute and sent her all decked up and scented up and like really putting on a show. And just as the rush of people were going into Salat al-Jumu'ah, it appeared that she was coming out from the Shaykh's residence and making a lot of noise about this. So, and they had mushawwishin, people who made noise. Look who's coming from the Shaykh's, this big scandal. And the whole masjid emptied out. And he'd just gone up on the minbar, he saw everybody leaving. And he was brokenhearted. And he realized. And then in that state of brokenheartedness, there were some of the students of Mulla al-Arabi al-Darqawi. They're making dhikr. They looked, and he had all this wealth and status and so on, but he was feeling empty. And these guys looked like they're poor and they don't have anything, but they looked very content. Yes, who are they? They mentioned they used to walk the street making dhikr and calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he went with them to Bani Zarwal, where Mawlana Darqawi was. And literally, because he went completely broken-hearted, the moment he saw the Shaykh, he had his great opening with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you don't know when, we don't know ultimately what moves us forward in life and what takes us back. رُبَّمَا أَعْطَاكَ فَمَنَعَكَ وَرُبَّ مَنَعَكَ فَأَعْطَاكَ. Sometimes Allah gives you and it ends up being a preventative, because you get busied by the gift from the giver. And sometimes He withholds and it's a granting from Allah, because it causes you to be more needy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But yeah, of course, the adab of ubudiyah is to do what Allah has said is obligatory, recommended, at the degrees of recommendation. Wallahu a'lam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.